React Server components are truly a game changer, and you can finally start shipping React Server components to production. If you opt into Next.js app directory in Next.js version 13, every component that you create is a React Server component. But hold on a second, but you do need to change your mental model while building components now. So let's take a look at React Server components and client components by going through a blog app together. So let's get started. So let's take a look at this diagram to understand the differences between traditional React applications and with React Server components and how the world is going to change now while building components. So if you take a look at the first diagram, right, this is a typical application. It has a server and a browser, which is the client. The browser will fetch and render JavaScript onto the page, and you ask the server for any sort of API data to show that data onto the page. We ask the data from the API. The components in this case are the card component and the text component that will show that data onto the page. Except in this case, the client is asking for the API data. Now, if you open up the browser, you will in the client-side bundle, you will see two components, card component and text component. And this is pretty straightforward. When the browser gets the data, it will hydrate that data. This process is also called as hydration. But now, this is how React Client components and traditional React works. But with React Server components, why not save the round trip? What if the server was capable of fetching and rendering that data, and all the browser needs to do is to hydrate the page, right? This is precisely why React Server components were born. So in this diagram at the bottom with React Server components, the browser is asking it for fetching and rendering all the server components, which in this case could be card component and text component. And in response, the server is sending a stream. And that stream is then returned to the browser, and browser then will hydrate data onto the page. Now, if you think about it, those specific components don't need a server. That is, they don't need any sort of client interactivity. They don't need any lifecycle hooks. They essentially don't need a browser to render the component, and they can treat those components as the backend of your app. And in that case, those components are really good candidates for server components. In this case, they are, so they are basically React Server components. But if they weren't, then we can declare that, let's say, card is a client-side component, which in fact will then be rendered onto the browser. So this is the difference between a React Server component and how our world with Next.js 13 has changed and why it's so important. Now, as promised, let's take a look at this blog app that is basically a Next.js 13 application that demonstrate React Server components and clients components, so you will fully understand what they are and how to use them. So now this example is pretty simple. It's a simple blog with two blog posts. And you will notice that there are these borders around every single component or page layout. They are essentially used to denote if a component is rendered on the server or on the client for demonstration reasons. For example, in this case, this entire app is wrapped with the root layout, and zooming in a little bit over there, you can see that the entire app is wrapped with root layout. Then is the blog layout, and then there is the React Server component as page, and there are two routes, blog and home. Home has nothing, right? But if every single blog post also has a card list component, which is again a React Server component. A card list component also has two cards, which are the two blog posts, and one is a deep dive with SEO, which also has a React Server component date. And then at the bottom, there's again React Server component date. Now, this specific card component is a client component. Click on one of the cards, you will see that this specific page is a React Server component, and the blog layout is a React Server component. In Next.js, anytime you want to wrap a specific route in a layout, then it's essentially called a layout component, and that is also a React Server component. So going back to the blog, this is a very simple application. Just like we saw in our blog app, whenever a component specifically is rendered on the server, it shouldn't show up on the client, right? So let's take a look at the browser developer console just to take a look. And over here in Webpack internal, this is the client bundle that will be shown to the user. Now, if you open it up in components, notice that there are two cards. One is a tags component and the other one is a card component. Now, as I mentioned, card component is in fact a client component, so that's there. And tag component is also rendered in a server component as well as a client component, and that's why tags has become a card component. But you notice that all the other components such as the blog layout, the page, card list, date component, none of them are available in the client side bundle. And that's because, as we saw in the diagram in the past, all these components are server components. And the beauty of this is now our client bundle is going to be really tiny. None of those components are being downloaded onto the browser. The browser doesn't need to do anything. The browser only needs to hydrate the data and return and based on the stream that the server sends, show it onto the page. And that is the beauty of React Server Components. So why should you care about React Server Components, and why should you opt into the Next.js 13 app directory to use server components? Just as an example that we saw earlier, the components that were marked as React Server Components were not included in the client-side bundle at all. This allows you to ship a really tiny user bundle. Now, in our case, maybe we have really fast internet. Across the world, we won't have really fast internet. If you start to travel all across the world, you will start to notice that data is not going to be as fast as your home Wi-Fi. In that case, the browser bundle is extremely important, because if you ship a really huge bundle onto the website, is going to be really slow. We want to make really fast websites, and we really want to make them really performant. And in that case, React Server Components play a really huge role, because they are fetched and rendered on the server, so we are able to ship really tiny browser bundles. On top of this, because a lot of your code is now rendered on the server, you will be able to reuse a lot of the code as well, because not every code will be required. Not every code will need a browser in that sense. So that is another advantage, but the biggest one is that you'll be able to ship really fast apps and really tiny browser bundles. The browser has less things to do. Now, there is a huge controversy with Next.js 13 that they are really forcing you to use React Server Components from the get-go. And we need to start migrating all our application that uses the pages directory onto the app directory and start using React Server Components. And that's not true at all. There are now two ways that you can build Next.js applications. One is the pages directory, which is our traditional way that we build Next.js applications. In that case, you don't necessarily have React Server Components. But in the app directory, by default, anytime you create a new component is in fact a React Server component. So you can slowly start to migrate your components into the app directory. If you want a performant Next.js app, and it will give you more capabilities of storing data and fetching and rendering data onto the server thanks to React Server Components. So you need to start asking yourself, as you start migrating your components to the server or to the app directory, you should start asking yourself, does this component need a browser? If that's the case, it doesn't need a browser, then it can be a server component. But of course, it's not as easy as that. You need to start restructuring your application a bit as well. Now, in the next video, we will take a look at how the specific blog app is built, so that you can start tweaking the application and sharing some of the code as well. So that's all for this video. I'll see you in the next one.